They called you the black sheep because you stopped agreeing with pain that had been renamed normal. But you were never sent to carry the family pattern forward. You were sent to see it. By the end of this message, you will understand why the cycle keeps repeating, why the system resists the one who wakes up, and how to begin breaking what your bloodline kept surviving but never healed. There comes a moment in some families when one person starts noticing what everyone else has learned not to name. Not because they are smarter, not because they are better, not because they are trying to dishonor where they came from. They just start seeing the loop. They notice how the same tension rises in the same season, how the same argument shows up with different names, how the same silence follows every blow-up, how apologies stay vague, how pain gets buried, then resurrected in a new form, how people talk about loyalty when what they really mean is endurance, how certain behaviors are treated like personality when they are really untreated wounds that have been living in the family so long they no longer look abnormal. That moment can be deeply unsettling because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And that is where healing often begins. Not with the fix, with recognition. A lot of people grow up inside inherited dysfunction and mistake familiarity for truth. They think this is just how families are. This is just how love sounds. This is just how conflict works. This is just what closeness costs. This is just the price of being connected to difficult people. This is just what happens around holidays. This is just how mothers are. This is just how fathers are. This is just how siblings act. This is just how our family communicates. But just how it is has hidden many wounds for generations. That phrase is protective of a lot of dysfunction. Because if something is always happening, people stop examining it. They begin managing it instead. They learn the rhythm. They learn who gets quiet, who explodes, who manipulates, who avoids who, smooths things over, who takes the blame, who becomes the joke, who gets scapegoated, who has to be the strong one who is allowed to fall apart, who gets believed, who gets dismissed, who is expected to carry the emotional climate of the room. Every family has roles, even unhealthy ones, especially unhealthy ones. And roles can become so deeply woven into the system that people stop realizing they are participating in them. They think they are simply being themselves, when in reality they are moving inside a script that was written long before they had language for it. Maybe one person is always the peacemaker, one is always the problem, one is always the golden child, one is always the one nobody takes seriously, one is always the rescuer, one is always the emotional dumping ground. One is always the one who speaks up and then gets punished for ruining the mood. One is always the one expected to understand everybody else while nobody truly understands them. Those roles do not form by accident. They form because unresolved pain organizes itself. That is one of the hardest truths about family trauma. It does not just hurt people individually, it creates structures, it creates unwritten rules, it creates emotional economies. It teaches people what is rewarded, what is punished, what must stay hidden, what must stay exaggerated, and what has to be sacrificed in order for the family system to keep functioning in the only way it knows how. That is why some people feel like outsiders in their own home long before they ever leave it. They were born into the system, but something in them never fully agreed with it. They could feel the mismatch. They could sense when someone was smiling while resentful. They could sense when a conversation was pretending to be normal while tension was flooding the room. They could sense when respect really meant fear. They could sense when peace really meant silence. They could sense when forgive and forget really meant swallow it and keep the pattern moving. That sensitivity matters, because many people who become cycle breakers were first mislabeled as difficult, emotional, rebellious, dramatic, or too sensitive. Not because they were broken, but because they were noticing what the system had trained itself not to feel. You may have been the child who asked questions nobody wanted to answer. The one who brought up what happened after everyone else had moved on. The one who could not laugh at what was actually painful. The one who felt sick before family gatherings and did not know why. The one who sensed that every holiday had the exact same argument wearing different clothes. The one who knew that one person always got blamed while another person always got protected. The one who could feel the grief under the anger and the fear under the control. If that was you, your perception was not the problem. You were recognizing the inherited loop. And recognizing the loop is the first sacred step, because what remains unnamed tends to remain unchallenged. The inherited loop can look different in every family. but its logic is often similar. A parent who never learned emotional regulation creates a home where everybody walks on eggshells. A grandparent who survived hardship without processing it passes down hardness and calls it strength. A mother who is never safe expressing pain becomes controlling because control feels safer than vulnerability. A father who is shamed for weakness becomes distant and calls emotional absence discipline. A family that never learned repair becomes highly skilled at pretending. A history of betrayal creates suspicion. A history of addiction creates chaos. A history of secrecy creates confusion. A history of favoritism creates rivalry. A history of emotional neglect creates adults who crave closeness but do not know how to build it without guilt, control, or self-abandonment. And then the next generation inherits not only the stories, but the nervous systems shaped by those stories. That is what many people miss. Family trauma is not only what happened, it is how what happened trained people to move. It trained their tone, their silence, their reactions, their expectations, their definition of love, their relationship to conflict, their ability to trust, their way of apologizing or never apologizing, their sense of what they deserve, their tolerance for dysfunction, their instinct to over-accommodate, over-perform, over-give, over-explain, disappear, explode, chase, fix, or shut down. That is why healing family trauma is so deep. You are not only addressing behavior, you are confronting inheritance. You are looking at patterns that may have been normalized for decades, patterns that were once survival strategies, patterns that may have helped someone endure, but are now harming everyone who keeps living by them unconsciously. And this is where many people start feeling the grief of being the first to truly see it. Because once you recognize the inherited loop, you also start recognizing how much of your own life was shaped by adapting to it. You realize some of your anxiety was not random. Some of your people-pleasing was not personality. Some of your hypervigilance was learned. Some of your fear of conflict was trained. Some of your guilt around boundaries was installed. Some of your urge to smooth over discomfort came from years of managing atmospheres that were never yours to stabilize in the first place. That realization can be painful. It can make you look back at childhood memories differently. It can make old conversations sound different in your mind. It can make you realize how often you were asked to carry emotions that did not belong to you. It can make you mourn the years spent trying to be good enough for a system that was never healthy enough to define goodness clearly. But this is also where compassion must enter. Because recognizing the inherited loop is not about standing over your family with contempt. It is not about deciding everyone before you was evil, hopeless, or deliberately destructive. Sometimes people pass down what they never had the tools to heal. Sometimes they normalize survival because survival was all they knew. Sometimes they call dysfunction love because they were never shown a healthier language for love. Sometimes they repeated pain because pain, when repeated long enough, begins to look like identity. That does not excuse harm, but it does create understanding. And understanding matters because cycle breaking without compassion often becomes another kind of hardness. But compassion without truth becomes permission for the pattern to continue. You need both: truth to see clearly, compassion to stay human, discernment to know the difference between understanding the wound and submitting to its rule over your life. That is the balance. And once you start seeing the loop with that kind of clarity, another question naturally rises. If the pattern is this obvious once you notice it, why does the family system resist change so strongly? Why does the moment one person starts healing, speaking honestly, setting boundaries, or naming what everyone feels, the whole atmosphere push back? That is where the second layer opens. Because family systems, even painful ones, are built around stability. Not healthy stability. Predictable stability. And predictable pain often feels safer to a wounded system than unfamiliar healing. That is why the cure gets rejected. The system knows how to operate with the peacemaker. It knows how to operate with the scapegoat. It knows how to operate when everybody keeps the secret. It knows how to operate when the same person swallows the truth to preserve the image. It knows how to operate when everyone pretends the holiday blow-up is normal, and then starts over next year. What it does not know how to do is reorganize itself around honesty. Honesty changes the arrangement. The person who says this is not okay anymore disrupts the emotional contract. The person who stops laughing at cruelty breaks the rhythm. The person who refuses to be the fixer changes the atmosphere. The person who stops absorbing blame creates confusion in the system that depended on them carrying it. The person who names manipulation makes the manipulator visible. The person who leaves the role they were assigned creates instability for everyone who benefited from that role staying in place. That is why healing in families can trigger rejection so quickly. Not because healing is wrong, because healing threatens the structure of a system built on adaptation to unresolved pain. This is very important to understand if you have ever started growing and then felt immediate resistance from family. Maybe you became calmer and they called you distant. Maybe you started naming your limits and they called you selfish. Maybe you stopped participating in the same old patterns and suddenly you were accused of thinking you were better than everyone else. Maybe you refused to join the familiar gossip, resentment, enabling or denial, and now you are treated like the problem. That response is not random. Systems reject cures when the cure exposes how sick normal had become. That line can explain years of confusion because many people thought their family was rejecting them. Sometimes what was actually being rejected was interruption. You were interrupting the pattern, interrupting the denial, interrupting the emotional economy, interrupting the arrangement that allowed people to stay unchallenged. And when a system feels threatened, it often protects itself the only way it knows how. Through guilt, through labels, through minimization, through silence, through mockery, through pressure to just let things go, through emotional punishment, through acting as though your healing is aggression simply because it makes old behaviors harder to continue. That can feel incredibly lonely because you are not just doing the inner work of seeing the pattern, you are also carrying the social cost of refusing to keep feeding it. And that cost can be heavy. You may feel like the black sheep, the troublemaker, the one who changed, the one who cannot just be easy, the one who ruined the old closeness, the one who made family gatherings awkward by no longer performing agreement with the dysfunction. But often what they call rebellion is simply your refusal to keep calling pain by gentler names. That is courage. Not easy courage. Not loud courage. The kind of courage that sits in a room full of history and quietly decides, this will not keep living through me unchanged. That decision changes everything. And it is why the family system often reacts so intensely to the first person who wakes up. Because your healing is not merely personal, it is diagnostic. It reveals what everybody else has been adapting around. Your boundaries expose what was normal only because nobody challenged it. Your honesty reveals what harmony was actually costing. Your peace unsettles people who learned intimacy through chaos. Your refusal to keep carrying your assigned role forces others to feel what your overfunctioning used to spare them from. That is why being the one who sees can feel so heavy. Because seeing is not passive. Seeing creates responsibility. Not responsibility to fix everyone, but responsibility to stop lying to yourself. And once that begins, the next layer becomes unavoidable. You stop asking only, what is wrong here? You start asking, what exactly keeps repeating? Who plays which role? And what habits have been passed down so long that everyone forgot they were learned in the first place? That is where healing becomes more precise, because recognition is powerful, but mapping the pattern changes everything. Mapping the pattern changes everything, because seeing dysfunction in general is one thing, seeing your place inside it is another. And that is where the burden gets heavy, because once you are the first one in the family who starts waking up, you do not just gain clarity, you gain discomfort, you gain grief, you gain the painful awareness of how many things were called normal that were never actually safe, healthy, or loving. You begin recognizing how conversations were managed, how emotions were redirected, how truth was buried, how one person always carried the blame, how another person always escaped accountability, how certain moments were edited in real time so the family image could stay intact. And now, you are expected to keep living inside the old language while knowing too much to believe it anymore. That is the burden of being first. You were often the first to feel how expensive the peace really was. The first to notice that the family bond came with emotional conditions. The first to realize that respect meant silence for some people and immunity for others. The first to say this pattern is hurting us. The first to stop calling loyalty what was actually fear. The first to recognize that survival and health are not the same thing. That awakening can feel deeply lonely because it often happens before you have the words to explain it. You just know something is off. You know you leave certain gatherings more drained than connected. You know the same people always get protected. You know the same person always gets blamed. You know the same conflict keeps circling back with new details but identical energy. You know the same apology style keeps appearing, vague enough to end the conversation but never deep enough to change the behavior. And when you try to name that pattern, you are often treated like the disturbance instead of the diagnosis. That is what makes being first so emotionally exhausting, because you are not only carrying your own healing, you are carrying the shock of seeing how much everyone else has adapted to the wound. Maybe you've felt this already. You enter a family conversation and can almost predict the order of events before they happen. Someone says something passive-aggressive. Someone else pretends not to notice. One person gets irritated. Another person becomes the fixer. Someone changes the subject to keep things from getting worse. Then later, privately, people complain to the safest listener instead of addressing the real issue directly. The tension gets buried. The gathering ends. Everyone acts normal. And then the exact same emotional choreography shows up again next month, or next holiday, or next crisis. Have you noticed your family has the exact same argument every holiday? Maybe the names change. Maybe the trigger changes. Maybe it starts over money one year, boundaries the next, respect the next, who showed up, who did not, who helped, who said what, who forgot something, who looked ungrateful, who took offense. But underneath all of that, the structure is the same wound, the same roles, the same silence afterward, the same forced reset without real repair. That is what a family loop looks like. And when you are the first one to wake up, the strangest part is not always the dysfunction itself. Sometimes it is how visible it becomes once you can finally see it. You start wondering how everybody else keeps acting surprised by a pattern that has happened 20 times already. But that is what normalization does. It makes repetition feel invisible. It makes predictability feel harmless. It makes people say, that's just how they are, as if recurring harm becomes less serious because it is familiar. It does not. Familiar pain is still pain, and the first one who wakes up often feels that truth in their body before they can articulate it in conversation. They feel the dread before the phone call, the heaviness before the gathering, the inner brace when a certain person enters the room, the old role trying to reactivate, the urge to perform peace, the pressure to stay agreeable, the instant guilt that appears when they do not play along. That is not random. That is memory in the nervous system. Your body remembers the script even when your mind is trying to outgrow it. That is why healing family trauma takes more than insight. Insight can name the pattern, but your body still has to learn that it is no longer obligated to participate the same way. And that is hard when the family system keeps offering you your old role every time you come near it. If you were the peacemaker, they still expect you to smooth it over. If you were the emotional sponge, they still expect you to absorb the atmosphere. If you were the achiever, they still expect you to keep proving worth through performance. If you were the scapegoat, they still expect conflict to find you somehow. If you were the caretaker, they still expect your needs to wait while everybody else gets handled first. That is why waking up can feel like waking up inside a house where everyone still thinks you are asleep. They keep speaking to the old version of you. They keep summoning the old reflexes. They keep acting confused when you no longer answer from the same wound. And this is where people who are breaking generational patterns often experience guilt that is not actually theirs. They feel guilty for saying no to dynamics they once tolerated, guilty for not staying on the phone during another circular conversation, guilty for not rushing to fix everyone's tension, guilty for telling the truth when the family wanted comfort, not honesty, guilty for protecting their peace, when peace used to mean making themselves smaller. But guilt is often how a system tries to recover its old arrangement. That matters. Because if you misread that guilt as proof you are doing something wrong, you will retreat right back into the role that kept the pattern alive. You will start cushioning your truth, softening your boundaries, re-entering conversations that have no honest future, calling it compassion when really it is fear of being cast as the problem. And that is how many people stay half awake for years. They see the pattern, they feel the burden, but they keep negotiating with it because being fully awake changes too much. To be fully awake in a dysfunctional system means you can no longer blame every conflict on a single moment. You begin seeing structure. You begin seeing cause and effect. You begin noticing how one person's volatility trained the whole house, how one person's silence created confusion, how one person's untreated trauma became everyone else's atmosphere, how unresolved grief turned into control, criticism, favoritism, secrecy, avoidance, enabling, emotional neglect, or chronic instability. That level of seeing is costly, not because truth is bad, because truth ends your innocence about the pattern. Once you see it, you understand why you responded the way you did for years, why you became anxious, why you learned to over-explain, why conflict made you shut down or overperform, why peace felt like something you had to earn, why your boundaries felt selfish, why your nervous system still reacts to certain tones and silences as if danger is in the room. That is a lot to hold. So if you are the first one waking up, be careful not to shame yourself for feeling tired. You are not weak because this feels heavy. You are carrying recognition your bloodline may have avoided for decades. You are feeling pain that others found ways to numb, rename, or normalize. You are grieving what was missing while also trying to build something different before you have fully seen it modeled. That is sacred work, and it requires more than emotion. It requires mapping. Because if everything stays abstract, the family pattern will keep feeling huge, foggy, and impossible to interrupt. But once you start mapping the dysfunctional habits, the confusion begins losing power. This is where things become practical. Ask yourself, what exactly keeps repeating? Not what do I feel in general? What specifically keeps happening? Who escalates when they feel exposed? Who withdraws when truth gets close? Who changes the subject when accountability enters the room? Who uses guilt instead of direct communication? Who acts hurt when boundaries are set? Who gets protected no matter what they do? Who becomes the family translator? Who always tries to keep the image clean? Who gets labeled difficult when they name what everybody else feels? Who gets punished for honesty? Who gets rewarded for silence? These questions matter because they help you move from emotional overwhelm into pattern recognition. And pattern recognition is powerful because it breaks the spell of randomness. Now, the holiday blow-up is not just a bad day. Now, the tense phone call is not just miscommunication. Now, the coldness after you set a boundary is not just everybody being stressed. Now, the pressure you feel to be the easy one is not just family expectations. Now you can see the machinery. You can see how the system maintains itself, how it punishes interruption, how it rewards compliance, how it keeps choosing familiar pain over unfamiliar healing. That is the beginning of freedom. Because once you map the pattern, you can stop personalizing everything. You stop asking only, why does this keep happening to me? And you start asking, what role is the system trying to pull me into right now? What would normally happen next? What part of me was trained to respond automatically here? What would a healthier response look like, even if it feels unnatural at first? That shift is life-changing. Maybe a relative makes a comment designed to pull you into defending yourself. In the past, you would explain for 10 minutes. Now you notice the setup. You realize the system is offering you the old role again, the one where you exhaust yourself proving your harmlessness. So instead of stepping in, you pause. Maybe conflict rises and you feel the old urge to fix it all. But now you can name what is happening. The system is looking for the stabilizer again. It wants you to absorb tension so nobody else has to face themselves. Instead of rushing in, you step back. Maybe someone gets disappointed by your boundary and the whole family atmosphere shifts. In the past, you would have folded just to restore comfort. Now you can see the pattern. Discomfort is being used to train you back into compliance. Instead of apologizing for protecting your peace, you hold the line. That is what mapping does. It gives you language. It gives you distance. It gives you choice. And choice is what generational dysfunction hates most, because dysfunction depends on automatic participation. It needs you reacting before you can reflect. It needs you taking the role before you realize one was assigned. It needs you mistaking familiarity for obligation, but mapping interrupts automaticity. It lets you see the script while it is still unfolding. That is why this matters so much. Because the first person to wake up in a family is often tempted to think their job is to fix everybody. It is not. Your job is to see clearly enough that you stop donating your life to the pattern that may bless others over time. It may provoke change in some. It may inspire healing in the next generation. But first, it has to become real in you. You have to know what you are looking at. You have to know what role you were trained to play. You have to know which habits belong to your core character and which ones were adaptations to a wounded system. You have to know where your body still confuses dysfunction with duty. You have to know how the old pattern reactivates so you can stop calling every relapse bad luck when it is really an invitation back into the loop. Once you know that, your healing gets sharper. Not colder, sharper. You stop using broad language for specific cycles. You stop saying my family is just complicated, when what you mean is there is chronic avoidance, guilt-based communication, scapegoating, and emotional inconsistency here. You stop saying that's just how they are, when what you mean is this pattern keeps harming people and nobody wants to challenge it. You stop saying I guess I'm too sensitive, when what you mean is my body is accurately reacting to something repetitive and unhealthy. That clarity is not cruel. It is clean. And once you have it, you are finally ready for what comes next. Because seeing the inherited loop, feeling the burden of being first, and mapping the dysfunctional habits all lead to one unavoidable question. How do you organize what you now see into a system that can actually help you break it? That is where the pattern recognition matrix comes in. And once you understand it, the cycle stops feeling like a curse hanging over your family and starts looking like a structure you can finally name, interrupt, and refuse to carry into the future. It starts looking like a structure you can finally name, interrupt, and refuse to carry into the future when you stop treating the pattern like a fog and start working with it like a map. That is what the pattern recognition matrix is for. Not to make you obsessive, not to turn your family into a case study while you lose your tenderness, not to help you judge everybody from a distance and call that healing. It is a tool for seeing clearly enough that you no longer get pulled back into unconscious participation. Because a lot of people know their family has issues. That knowledge alone is not enough. They can name the dysfunction in broad language, but in real time, they still get hooked by the same guilt, the same tone, the same holiday tension, the same late-night call, the same bait to explain, fix, rescue, defend, or collapse. The pattern recognition matrix helps you slow the moment down. It gives you a way to ask, what exactly is happening here? What role is being offered to me? And what would it look like to answer from the healed part of me instead of the trained part of me? That is where bloodline healing stops being a slogan and starts becoming practice. The first part of the matrix is this. Name the trigger, not in a vague way. Precisely. What happened right before your nervous system shifted? Was it a dismissive tone? A guilt-heavy question? A sarcastic comment? A parent acting helpless so you would become responsible? A sibling provoking you in a way that has worked since childhood? A family member rewriting history in the room? A gathering where everybody began pretending nothing happened after something clearly happened? A pressure to stay longer, say yes, keep peace, keep secrets, stay agreeable, stop being sensitive, stop bringing things up. Name the trigger. Because if you cannot name what starts the pattern, you will keep feeling overtaken by it. It will feel as though your body is reacting out of nowhere, as though the whole room suddenly became heavy for no reason. But there is always an entry point, a phrase, a look, a familiar emotional demand, a moment where the old system knocks on your nervous system and says, come be who you used to be. That is the first place to get conscious. Then comes the second part, identify the role being assigned. This is where the matrix gets powerful. Ask yourself, what role is this moment trying to push me into? The fixer? The peacemaker? The over-explainer? The child who must prove they are not disrespectful? The scapegoat? The emotional container? The one who keeps the image clean? The one who absorbs the tension so nobody else has to grow? This matters because the family system rarely says the role out loud. It just creates the emotional conditions that make the old role feel automatic. Somebody gets upset and suddenly you feel pressure to stabilize. Somebody gets disappointed and suddenly you feel pressure to bend. Somebody gets defensive and suddenly you feel pressure to soften your truth. Somebody brings up the past in a distorted way and suddenly you feel pressure to defend your whole character. That pressure is not random, it is role activation. And once you see the role being assigned, the moment changes. Now you are not simply having a hard time. You are standing at the doorway of an inherited script, and you can decide whether or not to step into it. That is real power. Then comes the third part of the matrix, trace the cost. If I say yes to this role again, what will it cost me? My peace, my honesty, my sleep, my self-respect, my clarity, my recovery time, my ability to stay present in my own life tomorrow, my sense of reality, my body, my marriage, my children, my future. That question is sacred, because one reason family trauma persists is that the immediate cost of resisting the pattern feels bigger than the long-term cost of complying with it. It feels easier to smooth it over, laugh it off, explain it away, keep the call going, stay through the dinner, say yes one more time, swallow the comment, take the blame, manage the atmosphere, and promise yourself you will deal with the emotional aftermath later. But later is where your life has been leaking. The pattern recognition matrix forces honesty there. It says, stop measuring this only by how awkward it is to interrupt the pattern right now. Measure it by what it keeps taking from you every time you do not. That changes things, because sometimes one more small compliance is not small at all. It is another reinforcement of the old bloodline contract. Another message to your body that says, your role matters more than your peace. Another moment where the pattern gets to live through you one more time. Once you see the cost clearly, the fourth part becomes possible. Choose the interrupt. This is where healing gets embodied. The interrupt is not always dramatic. It is simply the point where you stop the automatic handoff between trigger and role. Maybe the interrupt is silence. Maybe it is leaving earlier. Maybe it is not answering the baited question. Maybe it is saying, I'm not doing this conversation right now. Maybe it is refusing to translate your boundary into 10 paragraphs. Maybe it is not chasing after someone who stormed off. Maybe it is not volunteering for emotional labor no one asked for respectfully. Maybe it is ending the call. Maybe it is pausing long enough to feel your feet on the floor and remember you are not 12 anymore. That matters more than people realize. Because healing often begins in tiny interruptions, not grand speeches, not one dramatic showdown, a pause, a shorter answer, a different seat at the table, a calmer tone, a no that does not turn into a negotiation, a refusal to carry what used to land in your lap automatically. That is how new standards are born. Then comes the fifth part. Rehearse the healthy response before the moment arrives. This is so important because a lot of people think they will improvise their healing in the middle of a familiar family dynamic. Usually they do not. Usually the body goes where it has gone before unless you have practiced something different. So prepare. If you know the guilt text is likely coming, decide your response before it does. If you know the holiday pattern is predictable, decide your exit point before you arrive. If you know certain topics always become traps, decide what you will not discuss before someone asks. If you know a parent tends to use disappointment as leverage, decide how you will hold your boundary before the tone appears. This is not being negative, this is being awake, because the pattern has rehearsed itself for years. Why should your healing enter the room unrehearsed? A simple sentence practiced ahead of time can protect so much. I'm not available for that. I'm not discussing this further. That doesn't work for me. I'm going to head out. I hear you and my answer is still no. I'm not taking that on. These are not just words. They are structural beams. And then comes the sixth part of the matrix. Review without shaming. After the interaction, ask yourself what happened without turning yourself into the enemy. Where did I notice the trigger? Which role was offered? Where did I interrupt it well? Where did I slip back into the old pattern? What did my body do? What helped? What do I need to practice for next time? This part is crucial because many cycle breakers become harsh with themselves. They wake up to the system and then expect perfection overnight. Then one family gathering goes badly. One phone call pulls them back in. One guilt spiral gets through, and they start thinking maybe I am not really healing. Maybe I am just as trapped as before. No, healing family trauma is not proven by never feeling activated. It is proven by recovering consciousness faster, by returning to truth sooner, by staying in the old role for less time, by choosing differently more often, by becoming less available for automatic participation. That is growth. That is the pattern recognition matrix. Name the trigger. Identify the role being assigned. Trace the cost. Choose the interrupt. Rehearse the healthy response. Review without shaming. That is how you stop calling the cycle destiny and start treating it like something learned, practiced, and therefore interruptible. And once that becomes your way of moving, you begin doing something even deeper. you begin forging a new standard. That is the final work, because it is one thing to stop carrying an old pattern. It is another thing to build a new culture in your own life. Forging the new standard means you stop asking only, "What am I trying not to repeat?" And you start asking, "What am I creating instead? What will honesty sound like in me? What will repair look like in me? What will apology look like in me? What will conflict look like in me? What will love sound like in my home? What will boundaries feel like around me? What kind of nervous system do I want the people after me to experience when they are near me?" That is legacy work, because breaking the bloodline is not merely refusing dysfunction. It is establishing a healthier pattern with enough consistency that it becomes real, not theoretical. Maybe that means in your life, apology becomes specific, not vague, not "sorry you felt that way." Specific. Maybe in your life, peace no longer means silence. It means truth spoken without humiliation. Maybe in your life, love no longer requires emotional self-erasure. Maybe in your life, children are not expected to carry adult atmospheres. Maybe in your life, no is not treated like betrayal. Maybe in your life, conflict does not have to become character assassination. Maybe in your life, grief gets named instead of disguised as anger. Maybe in your life, people are allowed to be honest without being cast as disloyal. That is a new standard. And let this be said clearly. Forging a new standard is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming deliberate. It is about refusing to let pain remain your default teacher. It is about saying, "I may still be healing, but I will not keep handing down what I now clearly see." That is powerful, and it often starts in very ordinary places. How you respond when you are frustrated. How you speak when you feel disrespected. Whether you tell the truth after conflict. Whether you repair when you miss it. Whether your boundaries stay clear when guilt rises. Whether you let people be separate from you without punishing them emotionally. Whether you make room for tears, questions, tenderness, and truth without calling those things weakness. That is how a bloodline begins changing for real, not in one dramatic declaration, in repeated living. And yes, this path can be lonely for a while. Because when you forge a new standard, not everybody from the old system will understand it. Some may call it distance. Some will call it pride. Some will say you have changed. Some will accuse you of becoming hard when really you are becoming structured. Some will resent the fact that their old access no longer works. Some will miss the version of you that participated more easily in family denial. Grieve that honestly, because cycle breaking includes grief. Grief for what should have been. Grief for what you did not receive. Grief for how long some patterns lasted. Grief for the fact that not everyone will come with you into health. Grief for the child in you who learned too early how to monitor, manage, or disappear. That grief is not weakness. It is part of the cleansing. You do not forge a new standard by pretending nothing hurt. You forge it by telling the truth about what hurt, letting it shape your wisdom without turning it into your identity, and choosing to build from a cleaner place. That is what makes this sacred. You are not only surviving your family history, you are rewriting what future closeness can feel like. You are becoming the person who apologizes clearly, the person who does not need to dominate the room to feel safe, the person who can sit with discomfort without turning it into manipulation, the person who does not use guilt as a substitute for intimacy, the person who can bless boundaries instead of punishing them, the person who can love deeply without demanding self-betrayal in return. That is not small, that is architecture, and maybe that is the deepest truth in this whole message. You were never the black sheep because you were defective. You were often the black sheep because your spirit would not fully merge with what was broken. That refusal mattered. That ache mattered. That sensitivity mattered. That discomfort you felt around normalized dysfunction mattered. It was not there to make you feel superior. It was there to wake you up because somebody had to notice. Somebody had to stop laughing at what was painful. Somebody had to stop calling chaos chemistry. Somebody had to stop translating cruelty into, "That's just how they are." Somebody had to stop mistaking endurance for healing. Somebody had to stop handing inherited pain a fresh body to live through. And maybe that somebody is you. If this message is putting words to something your spirit has carried for years, let that be known. You do not have to fix your entire family to break the pattern. You do not have to win every argument to break the pattern. You do not have to get everyone to agree with your boundaries to break the pattern. You do not have to become the family therapist, savior, or judge. You simply have to stop volunteering your life as the next vessel for the dysfunction. That is enough to change more than you can currently see. Because every time you interrupt the old role, something shifts. Every time you choose truth over image, something shifts. Every time you apologize cleanly, set a healthy limit, refuse guilt-based control, tell the truth without contempt, and create safety where there used to be confusion, something shifts. The bloodline feels that. The future feels that. The people after you may never fully know the wars you fought in private just to make their emotional world cleaner. But they will live inside what your courage built, and that is the reward. Not always immediate family applause, not always instant understanding, not always everyone finally admitting you were right. The reward is that the pattern meets resistance in you. It meets language in you. It meets prayer in you. It meets structure in you. It meets a person who may still be healing, but who has decided this inheritance will not remain unconscious. That is what forging the new standard looks like. So move forward with this. Use the matrix. Name the trigger. See the role. Count the cost. Choose the interrupt. Practice the healthier response. Review without shame. And then keep building what you want. Love, truth, repair, and peace. To feel like from here on out, let your home become cleaner than what formed you. Let your language become clearer than what raised you. Let your nervous system become safer for others than the systems you inherited. Let your children, your relationships, your future, your friendships, your way of loving carry less confusion because you told the truth about what came before. You are not cursed because you can see the pattern. You are being trusted with sight, and sight becomes stewardship. If this spoke to your spirit, leave your testimony in the comments and pass this message to someone who needs strength to break what their family kept calling normal.